separatist tensions and sentiments have really stoked. It's like somebody poured gasoline on a fire ever since Mark Carney got elected a couple days ago, and we're all going to die in 2 or 3 decades if we don't hit net zero by this date.
But in any case, it seems to me that what's happening here is it's just kind of like a partisan determinism.
Welcome to Our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views, respectfully stated, are welcome here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Our National Conversation. My name is Sam Taylor, and the day today is May 3rd. When we were recording this, we're going to be talking about the recent Canadian elections, the continuation of power of the Liberal Party, which was until very recently quite unexpected. And today I'm going to be talking to someone who is both a Trump supporter and someone who's lived and studied in Canada. So a kind of unique perspective here that I really want to dig into. I want to understand more. So Connor, if you'd like to introduce yourself a little bit, maybe talk a little bit about, kind of what your experience of Canada was, why you were there, that sort of thing.
Yeah, first of all, my name is Connor Chung. I'm the Director of Policy Content here at Our National Conversation. I did my undergraduate degree in Canada, specifically in Calgary, Alberta. So Calgary is the city, Alberta is the province. For those who don't know geography too well, Alberta is just above the border with Western Montana. I was there for the better part of 4 years, and yeah, my worldview has changed a lot since I left Calgary 2 years ago. I've been back in the States ever since. And Canada's definitely been a formative experience for me. And when you kind of compare and contrast the two countries, I'd say there are some similarities between Alberta and the United States, but Canada as a whole is definitely, there's some pretty stark differences between the two countries. And I think that's something we'll kind of dig into today as we uncover, Mark Carney's miraculous turnaround for the Liberal Party, which seemed to be really in the dumps just a couple months prior.
Now, before we move on to that, I actually didn't know that you were in Alberta in particular. I was just looking at some maps earlier, and don't quote me on this. I don't want to get information wrong here, but if I'm not mistaken, if memory serves me, Alberta was one of the provinces where the Conservatives actually, managed to get a majority of the seats there. And you said Alberta was kind of similar in some ways, at least in comparison to the other provinces, to the United States. I mean, would you say that's the case? Would you say it's a fairly, a similar comparison could be made to rural America or something like that, a fairly conservative area? As compared to some of the other provinces, like what's Alberta like?
Yeah, Alberta. Well, they call Alberta the Texas of Canada. I mean, that's something that Canadians coined, really. There are a lot of shared historical. There's a lot of shared historical overlap between Alberta and the United States over the years. Alberta had a lot more trade with America in comparison to other provinces in the early years. Railways and such, there was more collaboration and just general commerce, I think, between the what was at the time more of a frontier in Montana and Idaho and those places. But I'd say those three states, Idaho, Montana, and Alberta, they kind of share this like rural, not just rural American identity. Well, I don't want to say that Albertans have an American identity because they share some similarities, but they are different in some ways. But they kind of share this similar identity with a lot of overlapping values. And that's something that I got to experience when I lived in Alberta for the better part of 4 years there. And yeah, you're right to say that, Alberta is a conservative stronghold in Canada traditionally. There are a lot of reasons for that. Namely, the oil and gas industry is it's pretty much the main driver of the economy there. So a lot of people, a lot of Albertans, excuse me, depend on the oil and gas industry for their livelihoods, and yeah, that's super important for them. And there's been a lot of heavy disagreements over the years between Ottawa and Alberta over resource development, over the way that money is spent, and the profits from that industry are distributed. And a lot of Albertans view Ottawa's policy as heavy-handed, as federal overreach, as infringing upon Alberta's sovereignty, and this is a big sticking point for a lot of Albertans who share this kind of rural. Also, they share this identity with Saskatchewan as well. The Saskatchewan is also has oil and gas, not to the extent that Alberta does. Their population is significantly less. So you can kind of think of Saskatchewan, as the province to the east, as kind of like a smaller Alberta. But yeah, there's been this real tug of war and butting of heads, not just recently, but for decades now, between Ottawa and Alberta. And it's really, we might talk about this in a bit, but it's really coming to a head recently, with separatist sentiments resurging in Alberta, especially considering Mark Carney's election. And a lot of conservatives in Canada feel that this could lead to another, who knows, 5-10 years or more of liberal hegemony in Canada, which is something that Albertans aren't really interested in.
Now, Connor, I'm going to demonstrate my massive ignorance with respect to Canada. But just to clarify, Ottawa, that's another province in Canada, and it's probably more urbanized. It's a seat of power. Can you just confirm that for me before we move on?
Sorry, yeah, I should have clarified. No, Ottawa is the capital of Canada. It's in Ontario, which is Canada's largest province. That's where the majority, you could call it the Canadian heartland. That's what I like to call it. That's where the majority of Canadians live. Between Ottawa and Quebec, that's, I think, easily 2/3, if not more, of Canada's population. So that's when I say Ottawa, it's like when I say Washington, D.C., in D.C.
Yeah.
They make these decisions. So yeah, that's the capital there.
Got it. Well, thank you for clarifying that for me. Now, you mentioned just a little while back, the Albertan identity is in some ways very similar to the American kind of northern rural identity, Idaho, Montana. But you hesitated. You drew back a little bit to then say, it is a sort of American identity. And obviously that's a very big rhetorical point right now. Trump, made the comment, who knows if he was being serious or just throwing something out there. Hey, why doesn't Canada become the 51st state? Why don't we annex it? That sort of thing. And a lot of Canadians had a very, very strong reaction to that. Carney had a very, very strong reaction to that, kind of capitalized on it, as it seems, as part of his platform, his message. Do you see that same reaction in Alberta? Just based on what you know about it, do you think it's maybe more muted than what you would see in Ottawa? Or is there still that very strong, hey, no, we're Canadians, maybe we share some values, but in terms of like sovereignty, in terms of integration with the US, whatever else, there's a pretty big line there?
No, I'd still say, I mean, if you were to put out a referendum today asking Albertans if they'd want to join as the 51st state, I think they would definitely say no. But the reaction was definitely much more muted in Alberta in comparison to pretty much every other province inside the country, save Saskatchewan.
Do you imagine that that's because of the similarities of values, or do you imagine that's, I don't know, just like, oh, well, we agree with kind of this overall conservative platform, so we're gonna, like, just for political reasons, we're kind of gonna give Trump a pass here, or this is just Trump being Trump, there's no reason to capitalize on it. What's your thought there?
Yeah, I think it was just kind of political pragmatism from their perspective. I mean, they're sandwiched, but between Ottawa, federal government, which they've had gripes with for a long, long time now, and the United States, so really they're the smallest player at the table here, and they haven't really won too many of their battles with the federal government in Eastern Canada, and well, even Canada as a whole just isn't going to win a fight with the U.S. if it decides to pick that fight. So I think there's a lot of political pragmatism among Albertans. A lot of them, I think, at least the ones who are more sympathetic to Donald Trump and the American conservative movement, at the minimum, probably just stayed quiet rather than saying one way or another how they feel about it. I mean, don't get me wrong, Alberta's two major urban centers, Edmonton, which is the capital, and Calgary, which is another large city in the south of Alberta. Well, they're urban centers, so they still tend to lean a little more to the left, just like anywhere in the Western world. But that being said, Alberta's culture is definitely still conservative. And I think recently, as a couple of years ago, polls suggested that maybe, I think it was about 20% of Albertans would be in favor of joining the United States, which is obviously a minority. It's not, it's not a number worth glossing over for sure. And that was a couple of years ago. And, separatist tensions and sentiments have really stoked. It's like somebody poured gasoline on a fire ever since Mark Carney got elected a couple days ago. And, I all over the internet on X and other places, all of a sudden I'm seeing stuff on the front page, that's gaining serious traction, talking about, is this it? This is pretty much is this the breakup of Canada? The fact that, we have possibly another decade of, a globalist liberal leadership on the table. And, Alberta wants to get away from this kind of net zero, heavy-handed federally enforced climate policies that, in a nutshell, would essentially destroy Alberta's economy, and hollow it out, deindustrialize it, and turn it into a poor province, like you see in the Maritimes, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, and Labrador. These are all rural coastal provinces that don't really have any industry. There's no jobs available, and it's poor. And that's what Alberta's looking at if, under Mark Carney, he wants to root out and penalize and essentially deindustrialize Alberta on behalf of, sustainability goals and environmental policies and such. And I think a lot of Albertans have kind of had enough of that, and they say, no, people's livelihoods depend on this, and we're not gonna do another 10 years of this.
So I want to change focus just a little bit, because obviously the point of this podcast is to really try to dig into and understand alternative perspectives. So I want to understand this overlapping perspective between the American conservative, the American Trump supporter in particular, and maybe the rural Albertan or other conservative in Canada who's looking at the Carney cabinet and you're thinking, gosh, this is, another 5 to 10 years of this. It's going to just be awful, So one thing I want to dig into to really try to understand this sentiment is this term globalism. I hear this term a lot in conservative circles. I hear it, kind of thrown at Democrats, thrown at progressives, liberals, and so forth. But I never hear this term, used by liberals or progressives to describe themselves. So I just kind of want to understand what is really meant by globalism, and how do you think this is playing into people's reaction to Carney?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and this is something that I planned on elaborating on. But before we even started this, because I think it is a really important talking point. So, I think, unfortunately, globalism is is associated. It's associated with conspiracy, with some shady cabal who, you know, have been planning this for centuries, or some secret society like the Illuminati or something like that. Globalism, it's a real force, it's a real ideology, and it's been the dominant ideology that's dominated and guided the Western world in real time for a long time now. Since the end of the Second World War and the post-war period, and especially over the last 30 years or so, since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And so all globalism means really, and, some people are on board with this as they view it as the future of humanity, as the only viable option going forward. And conservatives who are a little more resigned to these things, they just value different things. They value tradition. They value I think really conservatives look at globalism and they contrast it with tradition, with the way that the Western world has existed outside of the last 80 years, especially outside of the last 30 years, and say, no, we want to maintain that continuity. We want to maintain that hegemony. And that's what's important to them. So when you talk about globalism, essentially you have a few pillars, a few core tenets of globalism. One of them is open borders, okay, more or less, or at least porous borders. That globalism, which is essentially interchangeable with modern liberalism in the Western world, says that the concept of the nation state is outdated. There is no such thing as a national identity, and it's better for humanity if we allow the free flow of goods, services, and especially people between borders, whether or not you're a citizen of that country, that people and such are transient. They should be able to flow, and there should be an intermixing and an intermingling of peoples across the globe. It's inevitable. And two is the economic perspective that, free trade, global free trade also leads to these things, right? So you have countries dissolving trade barriers. People are traveling to countries where the work's at in the Western world. And that's why you have, people like Mark Carney, for example, who, in my view, is really the poster child for globalism. He worked for Goldman Sachs. He was a big wig there for 13 years. He was at the helm for Canada during the financial crisis in 2008. Studied in Harvard. He was born in Canada, raised in Canada, but studied in Harvard, got a degree at Harvard in America, then went on to get his master's and doctorate from Oxford in England. Then he was invited by the English, amazingly, to run the Bank of England. So he was at the helm for the English. He ran the Bank of England for a number of years. So he's this kind of, global cosmopolitan figure who's just transient, who, he operated out of London, out of Singapore, out of Tokyo. The world, there is no such thing as a nation state. The world is an international place. We're all part of this kind of global homo identity. Is what I like to call it. And, I think Mark Carney represents that. He represents globalist values. And I don't really think he's so much interested in preserving what, conservative Canadians would define as traditional Canadian values. I think he's more interested in promoting internationalism and global cosmopolitanism.
Yeah. So before we move on really quickly, I just want to make sure that I kind of got all your thought there. If I'm not mistaken, you said there were kind of three pillars to globalism there. I got the two, relatively porous to maybe even open borders, and this sort of like free trade, global commerce, that sort of thing, really in investing in that area. Was there another one, or, and kind of going through that, did you discover it's probably best encapsulated in two pillars here?
I think you could probably include global environmentalism as a core staple of globalism. ESGs, the environmental sustainability goals outlined by the UN, those are a big feature of globalist regimes all over the West. Mark Carney wrote a book called Values, where he describes, the most pressing political issue of our time that, governments should shell out all their resources and efforts on behalf of is what he perceives as, as the climate crisis. And so, that sort of rhetoric kind of gives you an insight into, his governance, what he'd be interested in for a political platform and such. And these are also features that you see, environmentalism all over the Western world. It's in the United States, it's in Western Europe, it's in Australia, Canada, etc.
Yeah. So I want to address each of these pillars in turn. And I want to kind of like push against and, as I said before, really kind of dig into what you believe and why it is you believe it. So I guess because it's been brought up a few times, let's start with this environmentalist pillar, especially because it seems, based on what I'm aware of, to be very applicable to the Canadian situation, especially. So, we've talked about how there's this kind of United Nations, globalists, notion of addressing climate change, working together to promote, environmental sustainability, transition away from fossil fuels, that sort of thing. What in this, I suppose, ideology or movement do you perceive as particularly threatening? I suppose the first question would be, with respect to climate change, are you someone who sees that as, this is a very real problem, but maybe the economic solution needs to be, much more well thought out or cautious, or maybe the costs of addressing climate change will exceed the benefits? Or are you someone who says, no, the climate change as a whole, it's overblown, or, there's not really a scientific consensus there. Like, just help me to understand kind of where your headspace is at when you think about this problem and why you object to this pillar of globalism.
I the way I see it, I think that humanity's impact on the world, sure, I think maybe it's I don't even want to say accelerated, but contributed to, a slight rise in global temperatures. But really, I think the planet has always gone through periods of cooling and periods of warmer temperatures and such. And I'm just of the opinion, my intuition tells me that a lot of this it's overplayed, it's blown out of proportion. And I just think that, yeah, I mean, I'm a skeptic. I think that there are always people out there who are willing to politicize certain things in order to platform themselves and gain more power for themselves. And that's really what it comes down to, is just human nature for me. So I think a lot of people see this as, oh, yeah, we're all going to die in 2 or 3 decades if we don't hit net zero by this date. But the way I see it is I see it as kind of like a veiled threat of sorts, where you have already very powerful people, I think, who are interested in consolidating their power internationally, not just nationally. And this is, the climate crisis is something that provides policy framework and governance framework that paves the way to kind of unify and homogenize Western nations, and streamline their governance frameworks and their legislative frameworks, and it kind of pushes them into this, I don't want to say like Western monolithic super state, under the control of some. It could be in the future like an international institution if the UN were to gain more, legitimacy in governance. But I'm always looking forward into the future. I don't think this is something that's going to happen overnight, but if we continue this way, who knows, 50, 60 or 70 years from now, the world could be a very different place, a less independent place, a less, a place with fewer sovereign nations and national identities.
So a few thoughts here. Um, the first one I have in terms of what you're saying there about people politicizing something for the sake of gaining power. I think that's always a possibility that needs to be entertained, and it's certainly always a threat. But I don't know that I see that as something unique to one side here. I think the exact same point could be made against people like Ramaswamy, for instance, who say, climate change is a hoax, but are gaining political benefit and sort of rallying people as a result of that. So I don't know if that to me signals, hey, it must be the environmentalists that are engaging in this behavior. I think that ends up being, in my view, somewhat of a moot point, just given, how universal it can be. And I'd probably need something more to see where exactly that's happening. Or maybe it's happening on both sides. And in fact, I think that it probably is to a degree, because you mentioned this point about, I don't think we're all going to die in a few decades. And I mean, that's where the climate science, to my knowledge, is at too. There's these sort of Armageddon projections. Hey, the entire United States is going to be underwater by 2050 or whatever else. And that's kind of the realm of TikTok and Tumblr or whatever else, or Reddit and so forth. But if you actually look at like the IPCC's studies, which synthesize thousands of scientific, journals, meta-analyses, things like that, from across the globe, there's kind of a middle ground that's being made where it seems to me that based on the research, the climate change situation is serious. It will hurt a lot of countries. It will devastate a lot of communities, especially around the equator, especially poorer countries. But, it's not going to be human civilization is going to be gone, in the next 100 years or so as a result of this. That's what I've seen. Again, I'm not a climate expert there. And you are also right, to my knowledge, to point out that, yes, we've had periods of cooling and warming in the past. But I think the crucial point that's being made here is that the speed at which this change in climate is occurring is pretty unprecedented and coincides very, very well with human industrialization. And sort of like, even though we've seen these sorts of trends in the past, we've never seen them in this short amount of time without, say, some cataclysmic event like the end of the Cretaceous or something like that. Obviously not as bad as that, but still the rate is I think what's concerning here. So that's just kind of my initial reactions to what you said there, just to kind of summarize. And then I kind of want to get your thoughts to, what I said there, that, the evidence does demonstrate that climate change, to my knowledge, is a pretty serious issue that is anthropogenic. And two, the intuition that people are politicizing this, I think, is equally applicable to both sides. And to me, doesn't lean towards the conservative perspective or the progressive perspective. I think it's just something we have to be wary about as citizens in general.
Yeah, no, I think both sides definitely politicize. I mean, humans politicize things all the time. Doesn't matter whether you're conservative or liberal, whether you're left or right in Canada or in America or in Europe. It happens all the time. And I see it among conservatives. I mean, it's just kind of the natural human playbook. So, I mean, I'm always on the lookout for that stuff. I recognize it on the right when I see it, and I also recognize it on the left when I see it. And so this is just one instance, among the adherents of, globalist ideology, where I'm kind of recognizing the potential for this. And, I want less decentralization in the world, not more centralization. And I think climate policy really paves the way for increasing centralization as if this agenda continues to move forward. If it is such a pressing threat, then the responses have been completely detached. A lot of people, and this is why you're seeing so much opposition to environmentalism nowadays, aside from the young idealists, the college age kids on university campuses, is that the working class is becoming frustrated. The responses have been largely viewed as kind of elite internationalist technocrats crafting responses to climate change in a way that in a way that essentially is leading to the deindustrialization of a lot of the Western world. So I think a lot of the solutions they're proposing are, the legislation is highly limiting on business and in industrial centers of development. And when you kind of just paste this one size fits all solution onto everything and say, okay, well, we're facing this climate crisis. The best solution is to just shut everything down. And, we'll hopefully figure out ways to create a green economy in its place. Well, in the here and in the now, people work in the oil and gas industry in Alberta. People work in all sorts of other industries that provide jobs and are really the foundation of Western civilization. And you can't just shut that off overnight or penalize people for participating in it. And that's something that even in Canada, which is highly liberal, there was massive pushback against the carbon tax. And this is what I'm talking about when I talk about this kind of detached internationalist technocrat class that kind of governs in a way that's completely detached. It really shows their lack of middle class experience of what it means to just be a citizen of a Western country. They govern from Singapore or London the next day and Washington, D.C. the week after that, and they're just all over the place. And they don't have to deal with the consequences of any of this stuff. And the carbon tax in Canada essentially penalized people for carbon intensive activities. It was going to be a tax that would be levied onto the consumers for carbon intensive practices such as driving or literally anything else like electricity consumption, yada yada, etc. And even among Canadians, there was a massive pushback against this, and they said, you got to be kidding me. I mean, Canada has one of the highest tax rates in the Western world. It's very, excuse me, it's very, very progressive, and so people are already being taxed at high rates there. You'll have to excuse the phone ringing there, and that's a big problem for people. They say, okay, we're already being taxed out the yin yang, and you want to put another tax on us like this. It's during a time when Canadians are already suffering even more so than Americans from post COVID, post pandemic inflation. It just really feels like a disconnected policy for a lot of people, I think.
So a few other things I want to ask about here. The first thing I think I just want to talk about kind of, something really immediate you said there at the end of your comment. And that's, you're putting these costs on consumers, taxes and so forth, very disconnected from people's everyday lives. And, maybe there's some long-term benefit, in terms of like environmental well-being, whatever else, or maybe for poorer communities, especially along the equator. But, for people there and now, it's a very disconnected technocratic policy. Now I'm curious, kind of why in your mind that is separated. And I'm not trying to do like a gotcha or anything. I just really want to understand, kind of the difference here. Because I'd imagine there is something contributing to this different perception. Why that's different from, say, Trump, who is, very much like, he may be leading what we could classify as a populist movement, but still very much like a, billionaire, moves around all over the place, kind of very, very wealthy, very disconnected, I'd imagine, from the middle class, except perhaps rhetorically, but just in terms of his day-to-day life, right? He implements these tariff policies, lots of immediate short-term costs for people, not good for the average person, at least right now. These economic burdens placed on consumers. It is just essentially a tax for the sake of long-term benefit, on consumers. So, I'm curious as to why there's a big difference there, as to why you might be more supportive of the tariff policy, but against this kind of what we would call globalist environmentalist policy. Like, what's the big distinction for you?
Well, I think that I think that conservatives believe in the long-term regeneration of the American economy more so than they do environmentalism. It's just a question of what they believe in. So I think a lot of conservatives are willing to take that on the chin, those price hikes that's going to result from that'll result from inflation. That's going to come from tariffs if it means, reshoring some of these jobs from overseas. From it would essentially be, we've talked about this in a past podcast, but short-term pain, long-term gain. And so it's really about balancing the trade deficit, which I think more and more Americans, especially conservatives, are starting to realize is, a massive problem. It's we're addicted to free trade and to cheap products that are produced overseas at the expense of working class Americans. And so that's a cause that we're willing to fight for. Environmentalism, I don't think for a lot of conservatives is it's just simply not something that carries the same weight or the same salience.
Yeah. So I kind of want to understand a little more why that is, because to me, what it seems like, this kind of just my perception right now. Maybe this is wrong, maybe this is right, but it seems to me like, okay, conservatives really value correcting the trade deficit. A lot of progressives really value, greater environmental sustainability and attempting to mitigate or adapt to climate change, things like that. And the other side, doesn't really understand, I suppose, the motivation or the actual tangible benefits of what the other is talking about here. And I mean, you mentioned before how, you haven't done like extensive research into climate change or anything like that. It's sort of more of an intuition sort of thing. And I'd imagine there's probably something similar happening a lot on the progressive side, that maybe they haven't done tons of research into the trade deficit, but there's sort of an intuition that, hey, this really actually isn't a big deal because, actually international trade and so forth, that's great. It's sort of maybe a flip, whereas conservatives would have been arguing for that in the past. Now it's kind of more of a progressive talking point. But in any case, it seems to me that what's happening here is it's just kind of like a partisan determinism, right? Like, you're kind of given, hey, I'm conservative, so these are going to be the things that I care about. This is the platform that appeals to me. Why does it appeal to me? Well, because I can see the tangible effects. Why can you see the tangible effects? Well, because I've researched this more. I understand this issue more. Well, why do you research it more? Why do you understand it more? Well, because it's the conservative point. It's what I'm exposed to more. It's what I hear more. It's sort of like this identity that I've been given or cultivated, and it's like that kind of determines this is the issue that I focus on here. So it seems like this is something that just happens and is part of human nature, on both sides of the spectrum here. And I'm just curious, because I don't know. It seems like there's a very big disconnect here, and it's like it's kind of rooted in this general intuition, which to me seems more like, I don't know if the term would be like a guise or just a label that's placed on our partisan inheritance. If that would be the way to phrase it. So again, I don't know if this is true or not. And I certainly don't want to, mischaracterize you or anything like that. But it just seems to me like this is what's happening very, very frequently. And might, to a degree, be happening in this conversation. So I just kind of want to get your reaction to that. Like, am I dead wrong? Or is there something to this?
No, I think that, a lot of people just kind of tend to jump on the bandwagon for what their party says. Totally, researching is hard and it takes time. And, I always try to expose myself to, to the opposition point of view. I feel an obligation to pretty much all of the time, or else I wouldn't be a responsible intellectual. But yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of people out there. I'm one of them who, who have exposed themselves to the opposition point of view and just don't really care for it or don't really subscribe to it with the same amount of importance that advocates would. In graduate school, I did take a class on. I had to take a class on climate change and such. So I was forced to read a lot of extensive literature on it and write papers on UN environmental sustainability goals and how these ESGs are making progress across the globe in various places. But I still, even after writing papers and after reading the literature, I just still don't subscribe to this particular view with the same importance that advocates of it would. That's all.
Yeah. So I'm curious about that. I'm curious as to like kind of the why factor there, like, because you said before it's almost like, I'm just kind of not feeling it, right? It's just, I just don't subscribe to it with the same enthusiasm. So I'm curious, is that just like a subjective personal preference thing? Is there more like, no, I don't really subscribe to it for this reason, or I see a deficiency in the evidence here? Is there something more tangible, or is it just kind of a feeling, like, just help me to understand here.
I don't mean to be too much of a cynic, but I've always been this way. I always question authority, and for me, it comes down to I just have a massive mistrust of post-war institutions in the Western world. There's not very many post-war institutions that I trust, with the exception of maybe a couple countries here and there who I think have managed to resist this homogenization, ideological homogenization effort that occurred after the end of the Second World War, and that's essentially what it comes down to for me.
Yeah. So again, I kind of want to dig in more because this is really fascinating to me. And really, just as I said before, the point of this podcast is to really try to understand where someone else is coming from. So, it seems to me like, all right, I'm not really super enthusiastic about this environmentalist or globalist agenda, primarily because I don't trust the institutions from which it's coming. Now, the next point there, I guess, is why don't you trust those institutions? Is it something, again, kind of tangible? Here's something they've said or done. Here's lots of things they've said and done. Or here's a pattern of behavior that shows to me, hey, I can't really trust any of this information. Or again, is it kind of more of a sense or a feeling or an intuition?
I think you can observe a lot of internationalism. I'm a conservative. I believe in nationalist movements. I believe in, sovereignty inside borders of countries, and I think that's something that's clearly been attacked and degraded over the last 8 decades by the global status quo, which is globalization. And it's in the early decades after the war, we were still in the Cold War, and these ideas were still developing and really taking root with it. But I think they really took root in the Western world, in Western institutions, starting in the 1960s, and then every decade after that, it just progressively, these ideas became more and more entrenched. Within the boards of academic institutions, at universities, in the staff and faculty, and our judiciaries, and our legislators, and all other branches of government all over the Western world. So for me, I just looking at the legacy. I'm a history guy. I love history. If you look at the history of the Western world over the last 80 years in the post-war period, there's been a clear and concerted effort to break down national identities, to break down the individual homogeneous identities of Western countries, and that's all rooted. To me, it's veiled under this term called progressivism or globalism or liberalism. And that I think that's kind of shielded by the status quo through the use of the phrase liberal democracy. And I love our democracy. I love American democracy, but I think that democracies in the Western world have been more or less co-opted, at least to a degree, by globalism. And I don't want to sound conspiratorial because it's really not. There doesn't have to be a conspiracy where there's just a simple alignment of, a coincidental alignment of interest among very powerful stakeholders who are involved. And that could be, It doesn't mean some crazy rulers or kings in a shady room, in a dark room. It's just the coincidental alignment of interest of big business in Germany, in America,
Development of the ideology.
who happen to be in bed with the politicians of Western countries, of civil society, of nonprofits. To me, these are all things that are definitely and inexorably connected to each other, and they're all different branches of the same. They're all different heads that belong to the same hydra. There is kind of what I like to describe it as.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So two more questions I had, and then we'll run out of time here. The first is just one last element of that sort of excavation, sort of behind the motivation for your beliefs here, Connor. That is, you've mentioned how. So again, to kind of summarize my picture of what's happening here, it's not really enthusiastic about the environmentalism or say X progressive point. Because it's connected to these institutions that I distrust. And the reason I distrust these institutions is because they are sort of against or attempting to degrade or diminish the national identities that exist in various sovereign states. So my next question would be, why is that nationalism something that's intrinsically valuable? Why is this cosmopolitanism, this just sort of citizen of humanity kind of perspective, why is that innately harmful? What's kind of underlying that?
Well, because I value diversity. And one of the best things about the diversity of the world is that you can go to all these different countries and experience their cultures. I can go to Japan and, it's filled with Japanese people, and I can experience their culture and their way of life. I can go to England and I can experience English culture, or I can go to Thailand and experience Thai culture, or the Chinese, etc. But, and this just happens to be, if you're subscribed to globalism, which some people do, they view it as a beneficial thing. I'm not trying to disparage them in any way. I'm just stating that I don't agree with this framework for the world, and I don't think it's something that should be thrust upon individual nations to either conform or essentially, be destroyed.
Yes.
And that's really it. It like I said, it comes down to that diversity of the world. And so when you take, the beauty of sovereign nations, of all these different places, who have their, historical, very unique, and, they should be celebrated, their historical identities, and you kind of dissolve borders and you make them porous, and you say, no longer do we have these, historical homogeneous identities. We're moving towards this kind of global cosmopolitan crockpot where, everybody just kind of mixes, and you might end up in one country or another, but you're from here. And it reminds me of like when I was a kid and I used to go to the soda fountain, and I thought it would be a good idea to do a little bit of every soda because I thought it was going to be good, but it wasn't good. I was like, this tastes terrible. And so it's concerning to me that, let's say, if China decided to, China, I don't think China subscribes to globalism at all. And, they've obviously been at the head of a wider global counter revolution to liberal Western globalist hegemony, which is essentially spearheaded by the United States up until recently when Trump was elected for a second time. China was fighting against this. They were saying, no, we believe that countries have the right to sovereignty, that, historical identity is important. It's integral to the success, peace, and stability of nations. And if you ask Chinese philosophers or academics, they'll tell you that, their historical Chinese identity, it's integral to the Chinese state, to the peace, the prosperity, and the social harmony of that. And so I think this attempted integration of Western countries. Yeah, it's really, I think, from a globalist perspective, from a liberal perspective, the intentions were good, that, oh, we're going to get a diversity of perspectives and, that's beneficial, and diversity of different ways of life. But tying back into Canada, this is something that I witnessed living in Canada for almost 4 years. And I was on the left for the majority of my life up until a couple of years ago. And that's why I moved to Canada, because I wanted to get away from the US because it was too conservative for me. And after living in Canada, after living under big government, which is, you feel the auspices of government much more in Canada than you do in the United States, after witnessing how fractured Canada is along ethnic and group identity lines, because Canada is highly, highly cosmopolitan. It's very, very multicultural. Some people value that. Some people see it as, an erosion of traditional Canadian identity. And I think that's where, Alberta separatism comes in, Western Canadian separatism. But after living in Canada for the better part of 4 years, I came back and I was kind of disillusioned. I said, wow, that there really is no such thing. Well, I don't want to say that. From my point of view, I didn't really see, a hegemonic Canadian national identity. I don't think anybody can really tell me what Canadian values are. You can't, when you put your hands on the American soul, you can feel its contours. It's clearly shaped by our historical identity going back hundreds of years. And I think, the more we have this global cosmopolitanism, the more we open up America to the rest of the world, and we have the free flow of people, the more it erodes that. And so I was sad when I left Canada. I said, Canada is just so fractured along ethnic and group identity lines. I don't think, for me, it's impossible for Canada to ever have a fundamentally conservative movement. I don't think they will have a nationalist movement, because there is no one dominant culture, really. I mean, it's and I think that's really a gateway to kind of permanent liberal, globalist policy and institutions.
Connor, I find that absolutely fascinating. Kind of 2 points you made there. One, right at the end, you said it's really about the unity or consistency of values. But then the other thing that's underlying the motivation behind your beliefs is diversity. It's a desire for diversity, just on a different level than what you would normally see in say, a progressive talking point or something like that. But, here I am talking with a Trump supporter, talking about why they don't really support environmentalist initiatives all that much. And it seems that a good chunk of the root motivation behind this, whether one agrees with it or not, is a value for diversity, kind of these separate national identities and so forth. I just find that absolutely fascinating, something that goes beyond the everyday ways we categorize the left and right and think about them. So thank you for that. Unfortunately, we're about out of time here, so we're going to have to kind of wrap things up here. But again, Connor, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on, for describing your perspective, helping me to kind of excavate it a little bit, and just sharing your thoughts.
Thanks so much for having me on, Sam. It was a pleasure.
All right. Okay, so with that, we're going to have to conclude here. If you were watching this on YouTube, please like, share, subscribe, do all the YouTube things. And stay posted on our Instagram and TikTok for promotional material for next episode. Otherwise, just, make sure when you're engaging in political conversations, if the other person is willing to have a respectful dialogue, then you stay right there with them. Thanks, everyone.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.